All right. So you might have heard that Tucker Carlson had a hankering for that borscht and sour cream that you can only get in Moscow. You cannot get that even in New York. You can't get your borscht. You can't get it made like you get it made in Moscow. So he went over there, and while he was in the neighborhood picking up the borscht, he decided to have a sit down with the godfather of Russia, as he is sometimes known, Vladimir Putin. And one of his questions was about Nazis. Because as you might have heard, up in Canada, we've always thought of those people as nice, and maybe it's just part of their hospitality that they seem to be very nice to Nazis. As well as other people. So here's for most definitely not the FSB, standing ovation and honors in the Canadian Parliament for a literal Nazi collaborator. That should tell you all you need to know about the West. Also, you can't get good borscht. So let's take a look at the Canadian Parliament honoring their honored emigre.
We have here in the chamber today Ukrainian Canadian world veteran from the Second World War who fought the Ukrainian independence against the Russians and continues to support the troops today, even at his age of 98.
Even at 98, he's still keeping that Zyklon B canister in his garage just in case. Wow, they are really excited about this guy. Wow, he must have served in a particularly heroic unit to get that kind of a welcome. So, let's take a look. What unit did he serve in? Oh, the 14th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS. He was in the Waffen SS. That's
really
like
the 13th Warren Grenadier, but they skipped 13 for good luck. You know, it's like the 14th floor.
Right. Yeah, no, Hitler was very superstitious that way.
Yeah.
So yeah, the Waffen SS, the worst kind of SS. That's the SS that won't even serve you pancakes. So here is Carlson asking Vladimir Putin about Nazis being celebrated in Ukraine. Now, as you might know, unless you got your education through Saving Private Ryan, World War II was won by the Russians. It was won by Russian lives. Between military and civilian deaths, they lost over 20 million people in World War II, dwarfing casualties of the Allies by orders of magnitude, and particularly the United States. So
that's true. I mean, that in no way minimizes the fighting spirit of Edward Burns. You know, he did great as well. You know, not knocking him. He's a very handsome man, and he gave it his best. And you know, everybody pitched in. But you're right. If you look at it, it was really the Russians who did most of the heavy lifting.
Yeah, you guys talking about Putin's lies?
Of course. So the Russians are a little sensitive, understandably, about the idea that in the end, the West kind of likes Nazis because the Nazis invaded them from the West, and let's face it, those leather coats never really went away. So, they take it as a signal. So let's see what he had to say about this.
Look, the president of Ukraine visited Canada. This story is well known, but being silenced in the Western countries. The Canadian Parliament introduced a man who, as the Speaker of the Parliament said, fought against the Russians during the World War II. Well, who fought against the Russians during the World War II? Hitler and his accomplices. It turned out that this man served in the SS troops. He personally killed Russians, Poles, and Jews. The SS troops consisted of Ukrainian nationalists who did this dirty work. The president of Ukraine stood up with the entire Parliament of Canada and applauded this man. How can this be imagined?
Okay, and I'm not going to keep stepping on it. We're going to play it through, but I just want to point out how crazy that is, because yes, he specifically said fought against the Russians in World War II. How on earth? Because remember, this is Canada. They actually have an intact public education system. How on earth could you not understand the implications when Russia was allied with us fighting against the Nazis of the idea that he was a Ukrainian fighting against Russia? So who do you think he was fighting with?
Oh,
exactly.
I'll answer that, Russ. I don't know anything about history, and I choose not to know. All I know is about right here and right now. I don't like your whataboutism.
Yeah,
and, I'm here to talk about what Russia did wrong and nothing else.
I'm not buying that level of ignorance. And so naturally, the Russians, who were brutally invaded by the Nazis, losing millions of people fighting the Nazis, seeing something like that. Kind of suspect that the West is Nazi aligned against Russia.
Well, there's a reason they didn't show it too much on American news. I had to show it when it happened.
Yeah.
I was on here with Pasa, Giordula. I mean, I was cackling when that old Nazi goes, Canada's always been on the bright side of history.
Liberals will choose fascists over communists every time. Liberals say they hate Nazis. You know who really hated Nazis? It was the communists who really hated them.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And that is carried over to its successor state, which I might point out is not communist. It's not a communist state. We have reignited the Cold War for our own economic reasons and for our reasons of trying to maintain our hegemony, but certainly not because of their ideology. All right.
President of Ukraine himself, by the way, is a Jew by nationality.
Really, my question is, what do you do about it? I mean, Hitler's been dead for 80 years.
Zelensky's like the kind of Jew who used to help the Nazis take out the fillings after the gassing.
Nazi Germany no longer exists. And so, true. And so I think what you're saying is you want to extinguish or at least control Ukrainian nationalism. But how? How do you do that?
Послушайте меня. Ваш вопрос очень тонкий.
Listen to me. Your question is very subtle, and I can tell you what I think. Do not take offense.
You are the kind of man I like to meet in a steam room.
This question appears to be subtle. It is quite pesky. You say Hitler has been dead for so many years, 80 years. But his example lives on. People who exterminated Jews, Russians, and Poles are alive. And the president, the current president of today's Ukraine, applauds him in the Canadian Parliament, gives a standing ovation. Can we say that we have completely uprooted this ideology if what we see is happening today? That is what De-Nazification is in our understanding. We have to get rid of those people who maintain this concept and support this practice and try to preserve it. That is what De-Nazification is. That is what we mean.
Right. My question was a little more specific. It was, of course, not a defense of Nazis, neo or otherwise. It was a practical question. You don't control the entire country. You don't control Kiev. You don't seem like you want to. So how do you eliminate a culture or an ideology or feelings or a view of history in a country that you don't control? What do you do about that?
А вы знаете, как вам не покажется странным, в ходе переговоров в Стамбуле...
You know, as strange as it may seem to you, during the negotiations in Istanbul, we did agree that we have it all in writing. Neo-Nazism would not be cultivated in Ukraine, including that it would be prohibited at the legislative level. Mr. Carlson, we agreed on that. This, it turns out, can be done during the negotiation process. And there's nothing humiliating for Ukraine as a modern civilized state. Is any state allowed to promote Nazism? It is not, is it? That is it.
Okay, so basically Putin's saying it should be made illegal to be a Nazi in the Ukraine at the legislative level as it is in Germany.
Well, I didn't take it as that, because what he said after that was, I mean, maybe that's what he meant, but what I took it as was, he goes, well, they have Stepan Bandera Street and they have it on their flag.
Right.
You guys don't have that on your stuff. They're not, the way it sounded to me from how it was being translated was, I really give a shit what's in their hearts. You can legislate no more sig heiling,
right,
and no more,
right,
without even a no free.
He said it can be dealt with at the legislative level, but he's also pointing out, as Keaton just said, the West will pick Nazis over communists every time,
and he's not a communist.
And there's of course he's not.
I was talking about World War II.
Right. But there's still, after World War II, as a lot of people have pointed out, the Nazis infiltrated our sciences, our intelligence divisions. Well, that's what I'm saying. I don't mean they clandestinely did. We brought them here. The West,
we put them on Disney.
The West in general. Yeah, well, that's Werner von Braun was on The Wonderful World of Disney teaching kids about the atom. There is literally a Wonderful World of Disney episode where, hey kids, let's learn about the atom. No, he designed park rides at Disneyland. So no, he did. Well, Werner von Braun, who took over our rocket program, the Nazi scientist. He was completely rehabilitated by the West. I would really recommend a song by the guy, basically the much less interesting and talented Mark Russell stole his entire act. A guy named Tom Lehrer used to do political satire. Look it up. It's on YouTube. Werner von Braun. His Werner von Braun song is fucking hilarious.
Because Mark Russell stinks.
He did that maybe 1963, 64. When you see it, you'll see Mark Russell basically took his act, made it not offensive to Washington people, and built a career out of it. But Lehrer was very funny. He really
was the cisgender Hannah Gadsby in terms of unfunny shit that only is.
The Washington Hannah Gadsby.
Off with like.
So what do you got, Keaton?
Well, no, I mean, that question, though, that Tucker asked was a fair question and a fairly tough one. People thought this was going to be just a softball interview the whole way through.
Right.
And it really wasn't. I mean, I watched the whole thing twice, actually. I watched the whole thing straight through, and then I watched it the second time. And you know what? It was even better with the sound on, I have to admit. I did watch it. No, that's a good question. Hey, how do you dictate the social and cultural trends of a country that you don't control? Like that's a fair and reasonably tough question. And you saw his answer. And one of the other things that Putin did not only did he say, well, they can basically legislate it out of existence, legislate Nazism out, but he also said this shouldn't be that difficult or embarrassing for Ukraine because according to the Western narrative, Ukraine is this bastion of Western liberalism. It is a democratic state. So he says, if it's such a democratic state, why should it be too much to ask that you take these measures? As you mentioned, Russell, Germany already has for fairly obvious reasons, but he's asking that the same thing be done in the instance of Ukraine.
Well, and the reasons would be similar with Ukraine because they fielded Nazi battalions.
Right.
I'm sure you guys must have covered this over here.
Yeah.
How the West press gradually had to say, well, there's no Nazis in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. Okay, maybe there's some Nazis, but better they fight with us than against us.
People said that to me.
And then they went to, not all Nazis were bad Nazis. It's a very simplistic view.
After they cheered the guy in goddamn Canadian House of Commons.
And that was when that article dropped. It was after that they felt like they had to go to the point of trying to muddy up the idea that all Nazis are bad.
Okay, but this is my favorite book because I imagine Putin, because Tucker was like actually...
Some of them were just freedom fighters.
Yeah, like Osama bin Laden back in the day.
Sure.
I'm watching Tucker interrupt Putin. I think he had to do it so he'll be allowed to come back home. He had to cut him off and be a dick like no less than 3 times, just to be tough enough. But the idea you'd have to ask the Jewish president of a country to make it illegal to be a fucking Nazi. Yeah. That's amazing. You can't even say, I don't think you should murder all of Gaza in a goddamn college in America. But full-blown Nazis.
His general that he just fired, not for being a Nazi, blasted out a picture of him with the head of Right Front,
Yeah.
a Nazi group that was deeply involved in the Maidan coup.
Yeah, well,
which
that's a message
we're doing a
Zelensky.
bunch of Tucker stories. There was so much in this.
Yeah.
He does talk about the coup in Ukraine. We're not going to be able to get to it. I had to subtract something, and that was it. But I would highly recommend watching the entire interview and check out what he had to say about how the current government got into power and how it was essentially a coup with U.S. backing.
Did you see people responding to when because Putin starts with like this long ass history lesson, and people were like, it was weird. First he started talking about history. I was like, wow, we live in the dumbest goddamn country. Take what Putin said.
I've seen libs trying to meme that.
Yeah.
Let me start with 4 billion years ago. Do you know how ignorant you are to even say something like that?
I prefer a nice Kamala Harris explanation of the geopolitical events. Well, basically a larger country went to a small one, so that's wrong.
The thing about history is it's historical.
Yeah. Boy, should I say? I should. All these people should have thought to say that during the BLM times. Like, what are you fucking talking about? History don't matter till it's time for a goddamn scholarship, right?
The fact is, the West had a very cozy relationship with Nazis after the war, and it's something that still informs a lot of elements of our culture, and it's something that the Russians, for obvious reasons, have always been sensitive to, and it's not something that ended after the Cold War, even in a certain fetishization. I mentioned the coats. I mean, yes, like these kind of leather trenches that are inspired by Nazi design, they never really went away.
You can't fault the fashion.
Well,
it was pretty ahead of its time.
I fault David Bowie specifically.
I mean, basically the first 45 minutes of the interview was this sort of retelling of Russian history as relevant to the current conflict in Putin's eyes.
Which it is.
And it is, absolutely. And it was actually really interesting to hear. Tucker tried to hurry him along a bit a couple times because he thought, and he mentions this in his sort of pre-interview sort of intro, he thought he was going to stall for time, get through the history of Russia, land on the current war, and then bail, I guess, was a thought in his mind. But as it turns out, it was actually Tucker who ended after he had asked everything he wanted to ask. And so he said, in retrospect, he actually wasn't stalling for time. He actually thought it was important to lay that out. Mm-hmm. And obviously, if you're in Putin's shoes, you're thinking, well, here's my one chance to tell my country's side of history to a global audience of, probably at the end of the day, hundreds of millions of people. Of course, I'm going to take it. And he took it. And it's really worth watching. That first 45 minutes of the interview was basically that. It's basically a narrative leading up to the current conflict. And then he asked him all these other points.
Yeah, and let's just be clear, because we're going to do a few more segments about this interview. Very predictably, Tucker was very maligned in advance. It's a little tougher once you see the interview he did, for committing an act of journalism. Of course, you want to hear what the antagonist in a proxy war with your country has to say. And there was a time that liberals, and I say that as distinct from leftists, even liberals understood that and considered themselves champions of the principle of freedom of the press, journalism, free speech. It's very much the frog in the pot of water. It's the narrative so gradually turned to the idea that you shouldn't platform bad actors, and that came and took the place of the idea that you should always have a free and open exchange of ideas. And it was moving in that direction, but the election of Trump, that was it. That was it. They decided that making sure someone like Trump can't win justifies torching whatever principles of the Constitution are required to torch. And you'll just find a justification in order to claim that it's within the bounds of the Constitution to do that. They're private corporations. All of a sudden, they all become libertarians when they're exerting pressure on independent tech companies to censor users. Yeah, Kurt.
Do you remember when the great Ezra Klein, founder of Vox, wrote a whole article about how deplatforming works. I got interested in that fuckbag term way back in the day when the joke wars started in comedy, and I started hearing all these fucking midwits going, well, that's platforming, and you're platforming. And I go, where the fuck is this trickling down from? If you even just say that
I said the same thing
word,
on our show the other day.
What?
That word is a buzzword, yes.
I want to pull a lever that drops you off of a platform if you use that word.
Well, it's funny.
He has a new outlet coming out. He's coming out within a few months. It's called Vax.
He's just a node, but they all said it. So that trickled down from goddamn academia. And it started in the shitty entertainment, and then the comedy and everything else. They workshopped all this already like 12 years ago.
Well, this is the funny thing about that. It's funny you bring up the word platform, deplatform, because that's been kind of circulating in a mocking way now. People have been pulling back out Ocasio-Cortez's video that she put out after Tucker got fired. Deplatforming works.
Wait, it does if you don't overuse it?
Kind of backfired, and that's what
backfired.
That's what we said at the time. What are you kidding me? Now you took the muzzle off of the most prominent anti-establishment journalist in the country, and he is whether you agree with him on everything or not. You cannot argue that is not the case. He is constantly putting himself on the other side of the establishment point of view, sometimes from a right point of view. But in my opinion, and what I've seen over the last few years, there's been an enormous evolution with Tucker Carlson. He's very far from the guy who used to wear the bow tie on Crossfire. It seems like he's very curious. He's willing to ask questions. He's willing to change his mind. Even now, I don't agree with him on everything, but I agree with him a lot more than anybody in the corporate media. And he certainly has more power and prominence than anyone else who's willing to ask the kinds of questions he's willing to ask. He's the only one who has the juice to get an interview with Vladimir Putin who would set up an interview with Vladimir Putin. And that has, as you can see from all of the insights we're getting from this interview, that has incalculable value.
Well, after you watch Vladimir Putin talk, go back and watch Biden talk, and then wonder where do you live? The dumb shit country? Oh, I guess I live in the shit.
Well, that's a whole other thing. I mean, frankly, whenever I've seen Putin talk, seemed like a pretty reasonable guy. I mean, he seemed like somebody that you could do business with. Do you need to completely control his internal affairs? I mean, that's a joke. We are in bed with Saudi Arabia. Our relations with a country are never defined by their internal affairs. They are defined by whether we consider them a client state or whether they show some independence. That is what determines whether you're on the right or wrong side of us. The idea that we're not friendlier with Putin because of human rights in Russia is Saudi Arabia.
Did people
Saudi Arabia is okay, but Russia's not? Get the fuck.
We're still in bed with Saudi Arabia, but we lost our not kicking us out for eating crackers status that we once had. We can't eat crackers in bed. We're in the bed but
we're still in the bed.
Yeah.
We're still in the bed.
Hey, come see us do a live stand-up show. We'll be in Bend, Oregon, Portland, Seattle, Philadelphia, Avenel, New Jersey, Boston, Palm Springs, Stockholm, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Berlin, and London. We're adding a second show in London. The first show sold out. See you there.